All right. Our producer says we're good. We are on the air. People are wandering in. That's a good thing. Kind of thin tonight, but it's good, There's more people coming in. So tonight we are going to keep moving forward, and we're kind of in that same time period as Ezra and Nehemiah that we talked about last week. But tonight we're going to do the book of Esther. We're not going to do the whole book, but we're going to do the first couple chapters of Esther. And we're going to kind of do a lead into Esther. So let's go ahead and we will get into this. Let's open with a word of prayer, and then we will talk about Esther. Dear Heavenly Father, we come to you and we thank you for this evening that we can come together and look at your word, that we can come and just kind of delve into this and see the many messages and the examples that you have set for us throughout history. And Esther's a great example of how you are in control and that your hand is upon everything that is around us all the time. So Lord, we come to you and we thank you, we praise you. We just pray that you'd bless our time here. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. So who has heard the story of Esther? I think everybody at least at some point has heard parts of it. Down in Branson right now, they are doing the Sight and Sound, I guess promotional, we're on the internet, but they're doing the Sight and Sound version of Esther. If you have a chance to get to Branson for any reason whatsoever, I would highly recommend going to Sight and Sound Theater. It's worth the price to go in and see that production. It'll wow you. So Esther is, again, in that time period where we have the Persian kings, Persia has taken over Babylon. So we're kind of at the end of the Babylonian stuff. We're into the Persian kingdoms. We're actually during the time of Xerxes. So we have some, things that line up with that. And it's just a unique little time period. The thing that makes Esther especially unique is the name of God, or God specifically, is never mentioned in the book of Esther. So in a traditional Jewish Bible, which we kind of refer to as the Old Testament, but we have the book of Esther in the Old Testament, where Jewish scholars do not recognize it as being part of their original book, or their original books of their Testament, their Tanakh, they call it, because it never mentions the name of God specifically. Now, it talks about the Jewish people, it talks about them praying, it talks about that kind of stuff, but it never mentions the name of God. So therefore they said, oh, this is not inspired, we're not going to put this in here. But every year at the Festival of Purim, they read the entire book of Esther. So in Jewish tradition, their festivals, they read this book every year, but it's not included in the Tanakh as part of the canonized scripture. Go figure. And it's over that issue. There are people that have debated this, and all the way back into the ancient texts that came out of the captivity and stuff like that. Esther has been one of those things that scholars have debated on, should this be canonized or not? Should this be looked at as a biblical Bible since it doesn't mention God? But yet you can see the hand of God all over the book. But we accept it as being canonized as part of Scripture because we accept this as being historically accurate, and I believe it is historically accurate. And there have been attempts made to try to discredit it and say, no, this can't be accurate. But to my knowledge, to my study, there has never been anybody who has put up a good enough argument to make me say, yeah, I don't think we should hold this as being authentic. So I'm saying, yes, it's good. So Esther is, again, during that time of King Xerxes in Persia, they are in the citadel of Susa, which was the capital of the empire at that time, of Xerxes' capital. And that's what the whole background of this is. So it's kind of a time where the Jewish people are very established in Persia because they've been there through the whole Babylonian captivity, and they have many of the people who are Jewish there at this time have been born there and have lived their entire life there and have incorporated into society there for the most part, but they were still seen as a separate group. They were a group that was brought in as captives. They were not Persians. And so there was always that little bit of a rift, even though, like I said, the people themselves were born there and grew up there and knew the culture, and that was their language and that was everything. They still were foreigners, okay? And so for the most part, like with most all of the Jewish societies that you see around the globe, they tended to gather into their own area. And they stayed kind of set apart from the other groups, which is due to them following the practices that they did, the law and things like that, which made them different from the people around them. So it says in Esther 1, this is what happened during the time of Xerxes. The Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. So basically from India all the way down into the area of like Egypt in that area. I mean, this was a large kingdom that he was ruling over 127 provinces, which is part of the historical accuracy of saying, is this truly the Xerxes that was the king of Persia? You can go back and look, and he actually was the king over 127 provinces. So, yeah, it lines up. It says, at that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. For a full 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. Now, this does not mean it was just a party for 180 days. Why? Because in the very next deal it says, when these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days. That was the big party. But I think what we're seeing here is Xerxes in all of his splendor, for 180 days, he opened up his citadel. And he said, come see the power of Persia. Come see the glory and the splendor of Persia. And he put his royal guard on display, and he put the palace on display and the city. And he said, anybody from any part of my kingdom can come just see how great we truly are as a kingdom. And so he opened up the doors. And people came in for that 180 days. And at the end of that 180 days, he gave this 7-day banquet. And it's, it really describes pretty much in detail what this banquet actually was. It says, the banquet was given for lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. So this was not just for his officials. This is for every resident of Susa. This is for everybody that was there, least to greatest, poorest to richest. You're going to come have this 7-day feast on the king. He's footing the bill. And it says, the garden had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink with no restrictions, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. So, this was a party. The king said, break open the storehouses and serve wine to anyone as much as they want it. There's no limitations. There's no restrictions. This is just going to be a big bash. And all free. For 7 days, all the food and drink you can handle. And don't worry about driving home, because we're all just staying here for the week. Wow. So anyway, that was his plan. I'm just going to have this big old party and everybody's going to have a great time. Then it says Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. So she said, all these dignitaries and stuff are coming in. I'll have a big party for the ladies, a big banquet for them as well. So it says, on the 7th day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, meaning he was pretty much in the bag. He commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass. Carcass, I guess. To bring before him Queen Vashti wearing her royal crown, in order that to display her beauty in the people and the nobles, for she was lovely to look at. Now, we're going to see here in a second, I guess we can go ahead and look at this next verse, but when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Now, there's some debate over this, because you have to look at how this is written, how this is interpreted, and look at the culture and stuff like that. But there are these guys who write these, commentaries and big, thick papers on this stuff. And there are a good number of them who say that when he said, "Come stand before my guests wearing your royal crown," he meant nothing else. Because she was a beautiful woman. And he'd been partying for 7 days. And he had a bunch of guys in there. And he says, "Come show everybody how lucky of a man I am. Come out here." And she said, "Heck to the no." She said, "I ain't coming. I don't care what you've been doing." Which I'm sure she's thinking in her mind, I know what's going on in there. And I'm not going to go be a part of that. So she just flat refused. She said, I won't do it. I won't go into your banquet. It says, then the king became furious and burned with anger, since it was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of law and justice. He spoke with the wise men who understood the time the 7 nobles of Persia and Media who had special access to the king and were highest in the kingdom. So basically, when she said no, he became enraged and said, "Send in my legal team. I want my attorneys." And that's basically what these guys were. They were well versed in law as well as customs. And he says, I want my advisors. I want my attorneys here. I want to know what I can do about this. I've had it. So he calls them in, and it says, according to the law, what must be done to Queen Vashti, he asked. She has not obeyed the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her. Then Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the people of all the provinces of King Xerxes. He said, this is not just an affront to the throne, not just disgracing you. This is a disgrace to our entire nation. Our entire kingdom is at stake. And he said, she must be made an example of. Then he goes on and he says, for the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of the disrespect and discord. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. And let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. So he says, here's the deal, king. He said, if you let her get away with this, then our whole law and order breaks down. Our hierarchy. Now, we can have a long debate over should men be this hierarchy. You know, that's this terrible thing of a man being the head of his household. And we can have that debate, but what this person is actually saying, take it out of that realm for a second, and he says, it doesn't really matter. What matters is this is what the law says, and if you don't enforce the law, we have no law. So look at it from that perspective. It's real similar to what we see a lot of times today in our culture. If we say we refuse to enforce a law, We have no law. And that's what's happened in a lot of places in our country, is they have just said, we're not going to enforce this anymore. So therefore, law doesn't exist. And that's the deeper issue that this guy's getting to. Yeah, we can talk about this, patriarchal society and how oppressive they were to their wives and all that kind of stuff. And, it wasn't 21st century America or 21st century any place. And so that's just a put off issue to me. We can't go back into history and judge them according to our values and standards now. But what this guy is saying is, this is what the book says. This is what the law says. And if we don't enforce it, we have nothing. Chaos will ensue. Because we've just told everybody, from the highest official down, there is no law and order. And so he says, you got to do something. It says, then when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest. The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice. So the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, and to each people in their own language, proclaiming that every man should be ruler over his own household, using his native tongue. So again, we can get into the debate of how this fits into our society, but it makes no difference. This is Persian society, and this is 500 years before Christ. So if you want to put them on trial, go ahead. But this has no bearing on that part of our society. But what I'm saying is, they said this is what it's going to be. We are going to lay down the law, and it's going to be followed according to the law of the Medes and Persians. Boom, put a lid on it. Now, you can, again, argue all day whether that was right, wrong, or indifferent, but it's very similar to what we have in the Old Testament law of God. If a person does this, this is the punishment. There is no debate. There is no, well, let's look at this, because as soon as you start doing that, the law means nothing. And so Xerxes knew that if he was going to keep reign over 127 provinces, he better go ahead and issue a decree and say, this is what it's going to be. I'm still the king, and I'm in control. And so it says, later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the young women who please the king be queen instead of Vashti. So they're having open auditions for queen. They sent out 127 guys, one to each province, and said, bring me the most beautiful woman you can find. Woman or women, whatever. Bring them to me, and I'm going to bring them into the king's harem, and we are going to treat them like princesses. They're going to get months and months of beauty treatments and spa and whatever else. And we're going to give them every opportunity to make themselves as beautiful as they can be made, so they can present themselves before the king, and he can choose the one that he wants to be the next king. Okay? So it says, this advice appealed to the king, you think. And he followed it. He's like, yeah, let's do it. Auditions are now open. And so it says, now there was a citadel of, in the citadel of Susa, a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, along with those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah. So there's a question mark here in the wording of this. If Mordecai was taken during that time that Jehoiakim was actually taken into captivity and Jerusalem fell, he would have had to be pretty young. Or he's really old now. And so there are those who believe that when they give his lineage, we know he's of the tribe of Benjamin, we know he's the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, that it was actually probably his ancestors that were taken from Jerusalem, and that he was probably born just after that. It very much is possible, though, that he was a young boy who was taken from Jerusalem and is now, in his 70s or whatever. And so there is that possibility that he was carried off in that last deportation, the 586. But he would be, pretty old at this point, because they believe that this was taken place around 478, 479. So even at that, if he was, of any age whatsoever, he'd be actually like 90 or 100. So, the way Hebrew writing is done and the way this story is being told, it very well could mean that his family was taken from Jerusalem at that time, and he was born to them as captives. And it still means basically the same thing. It says Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up, because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her in as his own daughter when her father and mother died. So Mordecai's cousin, Esther, she was probably quite a bit younger than him, came to be under his care. Now, just a little word trivia for you here. Vashti, who was the king, or was the queen during the first part of this story, Vashti means the greatest, the best. Okay? So that queen was the best. Esther means star, the star. So she's above the best, I guess, whatever you want to say. But so there's words in here that have specific meaning that sometimes I think we kind of just blow by and don't think about. But that's what, Vashti was the best. She was the most beautiful in the kingdom that they believed at that time, until this rising star comes, which is Esther. Also the reason, and we're going to read that here in just a few verses, the reason that she has two names, Hadassah and Esther, is Hadassah is her Hebrew name, okay? And so the Hebrews who had been in Persia for this long time, like we talked about at the very beginning, many of them not only had worked into society, but they had also worked their names into Persian names. So she was probably given two names. This is your official name, your Hebrew name, Hadassah. But Esther is the name you will go by in society. It was not a brand new name given to her at this time. Because the people who wanted to kind of fit into society, not that they were denying their Hebrew heritage per se, but if you were going to survive well in this society, you not only had to incorporate into Persian society, you had to kind of look Persian. And you had to sound Persian. And so she had her Persian name, which was Esther. It says, when the king's orders and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, whom he had charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor immediately, who provided her and whatever else so that she can be absolutely as beautiful as possible. And so this process of her becoming the queen starts with her earning the favor or God giving her the favor of Haggai as soon as she really arrives. He catches her eye, she catches his eye, and he goes, this is one. And so we don't know exactly how long that period is right there, but he set her aside and said, you're moving to the front of the pack because I see real potential here. So Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. And there's that thing again where Mordecai is going, hey, if you're going to survive, you need to be Persian. If you're Jewish, they're going to reject you out. They're going to do whatever. They might even persecute you because Jewish people were still seen as those people that were brought here in captivity. So he said, just go by Esther. Don't reveal your background. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Before a young woman's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. I don't know, any ladies here interested in getting a year-long spa? It said, and this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem to the care of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. So they would go and spend the night with the king, and they could take anything they wanted from the royal harem thing. So they could make themselves up any way they wanted to. They could take, basically props, whatever, to make their entrance as grand as possible. They could use smoke and mirrors, whatever they wanted to do, so they could wow the king. And they had anything at their disposal because they wanted to make that great entrance. And it said she would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. So it's kind of a one and done unless you really impressed him. And if you really impressed him, then he could call you by name out of the concubines. But it wasn't okay, now you're in the royal palace and you're just wandering around with him there. No, it means you're part of his harem, you're part of the concubines, but you live in this other area of the palace and you may never see the king again. So it says, when the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. See, here's the other thing, is Esther was humble before the king. The other ladies would try to make themselves up and be as impressive as possible. Ba-ba! She humbled herself and she said, Haggai, tell me what the king likes. And he said, well, this is the kind of king, this is the kind of man the king is. And she took his suggestion and she took nothing else with her. She just humbly was obedient to what she was called to do. And so she walked into the king's presence, and it says, and Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. The simplicity, the humility, the grace, whatever you want to call it, just wowed the people. And so it says, she was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So he said, auditions are over. I've got my queen. This is the one. She is now the queen of Persia. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. Now, let me back up for just a second, because I just thought of something. The other thing we have to remember here is she was probably not the only queen. She definitely wasn't his only wife or concubine. He had a whole residence for them over here. Think of King Solomon. How many wives and concubines did he have? So this is before that, or about that same time, a little bit later, I guess, because King Solomon was way before this. But so how many wives did he have? How many concubines did he have? Was it even possibly that he had other queens at other palaces? We don't know. And so the reason I bring this up is because there have been some scholars who say, well, this is simple to confirm. Let's go back and look up King Xerxes, and we'll just see who his queen was. And if it says Queen Vashti or Queen Esther, then the Bible's right, and there it is. Well, they look it up, and they go, it doesn't say either one of them. But it doesn't give much information about the queens, and it's known from history and their own writings that he may have had many. But she was the one in Susa who was with him at this time and had his ear and his influence, okay? So we have to be careful that when we use the things in the Bible that are indicated, like a name like Xerxes, that we don't also say, well, then this is simple. I should be able to look this up in the records of Persia and read this whole story exactly like it is. No, it's not that simple. But you can read a lot about Xerxes, because he had a lot of campaigns and he had a lot of things that he did. But queens weren't nearly as recorded because, that it wasn't about them. It was about him. And so you don't find a lot of queen names and stuff. And so she may have been the only queen, the actual queen, or she may have been the queen of Susa in that area or that province or that district, which had the ruling over all the other districts because that's where the king was located. But there was definitely more wives and concubines that were out there. So it says, he proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. He was just giving away prizes. When the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, but Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do. For she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions, as she had done when he was bringing her up. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. Now, we'll get into more of this story as we, go in. We'll see, I guess, the interaction. It wasn't just as simple as her saying to the king, hey, honey, somebody's trying to kill you here. There's a process that the queen had to go through to even come before the king. Persian Empire was very different from some of what we might think of now. The queen did not just have unlimited access to the king. She had to be summoned by the king. She had to be invited to come before him. And if she just showed up on her own or said, hey, I want to talk to you, and just showed up, he could either say, yeah, go ahead and come forward, or he could refuse to raise his scepter and she would be put to death because you didn't approach the king unless you were told you can approach the king. So her going and turning this in about what happened and giving the credit to Mordecai was more of a process than just saying, hey, somebody wants to kill you. There was a lot that went into this as well. And so she revealed this plot, and once it was found out and investigated, as we're going to see here, then she gave the credit to Mordecai and said he's the one who actually heard the plot, and he's the one who turned them in. So it says, and when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles, and all this was recorded in the book of the annals of the presence of the king. Now, that little phrase, all this was recorded in the book of the annals of the presence of the king, in the presence of the king, seems like such a weird little statement. We see it all the time in the Old Testament when we're reading through the book of Kings and Chronicles and stuff, where it says this wasn't the rest of their events of their life written down in the book of the Chronicle or Chronicles of the King or whatever. They got all these different phrases and stuff. And so we look at something like this and we go, oh yeah, Mordecai uncovered the plot. He turned them in. They put them to death, and they recorded it in a book. There you go. Okay, one for Mordecai. In the case of Esther, if you remember the story, this little phrase right here is a key piece that comes back to play later. because Mordecai, even though he did something as great as saving the king's life, so many things happen in the king's life that many years later, he doesn't remember it. He doesn't remember who this guy is. He's one of the thousands that live in Susa, tens of thousands. So he's like, yeah, he's just another guy. So this will come back into play at a later time. But that's kind of the main thing of these first couple chapters. Now, we've got a little more time, so I want to touch on next week's lesson. So you guys get a little insight that the other people will have to ask you for the information. Maybe we might touch on it next week, but you're getting the whole thing. And that is, if you go into Esther 3, verses 1 and 2, which we're not going to do more than just these two verses, it says, after these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him, but Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Okay? So again, there's this little passing thing. Haman is an Agagite. Okay? Is that like a skin condition? Or is it a dietary thing? Or what is it? Well, an Agagite, now there's some debate on this, and again, scholars still go back and forth on this whole thing, but there's a reason that Mordecai hated the Jewish people. And it's akin to the Hatfields and the McCoys. I'm sorry, what'd you say? Haman, what'd I say? I'm sorry. Haman hated the Jews. Mordecai was a Jew. There's a reason that Haman hated the Jews, and that's because it's like a family feud. It's the Hatfields and the McCoys. And you say, well, where do we get this information? Where do the scholars pull this from and look at it? So I want to give you guys the bonus round tonight, and we're going to go back and look at the Agagites. Okay? 1 Samuel 15. It says, Samuel said to Saul, I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel. So listen now to the message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. So the Amalekites attacked Israel, and God said, I told him I'd get them. This is my opportunity. So Saul, you're my weapon. You're my person who is going to bring about my justice. Now go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. Kill them all. Total annihilation of the Amalekites for what they did to my people. So Saul summoned the men and mustered them at Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 from Judah. Saul went to the city of Amalek and set an ambush in the ravine. Then he said to the Kenites, go away, leave the Amalekites, so that I do not destroy you along with them, for you showed kindness to all the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt. So the Kenites moved away from the Amalekites. Then Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt. Ready? He took Agag. Do you see Agag? Agag, descendants were the Agagites. Took King Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, which he wasn't supposed to. and has turned and gone on down to Gilgal. When Samuel reached him, Saul said, "The Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions. I did everything you told me to do." But Samuel said, "What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear?" Saul answered, "The soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and the cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God." Well, that wasn't what they were told to do. They disobeyed God, thinking they could please him by doing it their way. It goes back to what we say a lot of times on Sunday morning, because they thought they knew better than God. Well, gosh, if God would have seen this, he would have realized this is some good sacrifice in here. So we know more than God does. We'll do it our way. Sound familiar? But we totally destroyed the rest. "Enough," Samuel said to Saul. "Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night." "Tell me," Saul replied. Samuel said, "Although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and he sent you on a mission saying, 'Go and completely destroy those wicked people, the Amalekites. Wage war against them until you have wiped them out.' Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord?" "But I did obey the Lord," Saul said. "I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag, their king. The soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder, the best of what was devoted to God, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal." But Samuel replied, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king." Now, scholars believe that the Agagites, like what Mordecai was, were descendants that were spared in this attack, because we know that Agag gets put to death. But they were other people from that royal line that were spared when the rest of their community, their country, basically was wiped out. Saul did not follow the Lord's command. Here's the irony. Saul was a Benjamite. He was of the tribe of Benjamin. So was Mordecai. So you have potentially, again, this is up to scholarly debate, but a descendant of King Agag who lost everything to Saul, a Benjamite. And then you have a descendant of Agag who is standing before a descendant of Saul. Hatfields and McCoys. I've got a good reason to wipe you and all your people out, because I have no heritage now. Because you guys, you Israelites, completely destroyed my nation. I have no sympathy for you. Again, there's some scholarly debate on this, but to me, that really kind of rounds out the picture of why Mordecai has such a bitter taste for these Jews, for these people from Israel. We remember, you know. And so there's got to be a reason that they add that little disclaimer in there that he was an Agagite. Otherwise, what difference would it make? But it's a descendant line from the Amalekites. And so you have the Amalekites, or what was left of them, who are now going to have their chance to reap vengeance on the Israelites, or what's left of them after the dispersion. And so that, to me, kind of makes a little bit more sense. So next week, we're going to read about Mordecai, the Agagite. Mordecai, I keep mixing those guys up. Haman, the Agagite, and Mordecai, the Jew, and see how that kind of plays out. It also would explain why Mordecai says, "There's no way I'm bowing to this guy. He's an Amalekite, and I know the Amalekites. I've heard my stories. I know what they did to our people as we came up out of Egypt." And so, again, it's that blood feud of, you guys attacked us and tried to wipe us out, but God protected us. We wiped you guys out because God led us, and now it's your chance to come back and try to wipe us out. And so Mordecai's saying, I don't want Haman coming around, and Haman's going, ooh, I want to get these Jews. And so there's that blood feud. Again, it's up for scholarly debate. If you want to enter that debate, that's fine, but that's the explanation that is given by many people. So, all right, questions about that? Yes? Probably just expelled her, might have put her to death. It would have been his privilege or prerogative, and they never talk about Vashti again. So he might have had her put to death, but most likely just said, go away. Go back to whence you came. But, because what we have there, it wouldn't seem like he would put her to death because it says, you will never appear before the king again. It doesn't say, he dispatched her or something, but basically, you need to leave Susa. You're done. You need to go. And so she was deposed as queen and sent out, would be my interpretation. He had the right to put her to death, but I don't know if he would have. Absolutely. Yep. Right. Yeah, and that's the whole, that Benjamin tribe. Shimei is actually a descendant of Saul, which would make Mordecai and Esther a direct descendant of Saul. And with Haman as an Agagite, he'd be probably a direct descendant of King Agag. So yeah, it really brings that family feud back together. So yes, thank you. That's good. All right. Well, everybody at home,